It's a pleasure to introduce the final speaker of this morning's session, Mr. Jack Bobo. Jack is the Director of Global Food Security and Water Policy at the Nature Conservancy. He's previously served as the CEO of Futurity, a food foresight company, and is the author of the 2021 book, Why Smart People Make Bad Food Choices. Recognized by Scientific American as one of the 100 most influential people in biotechnology, he's also served as the Chief Communications Officer for Global Policy at Intrexon Corporation and as a Senior Advisor for Food Policy at the U.S. Department of State. He has multiple degrees, which include a Juris Doctor, a Master of Science in Environmental Science, a Bachelor of Science in Biology, and a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology and Chemistry. Please help me welcome Mr. Jack Bobo.
Thank you. I normally like to start with low expectations. That way I can meet them. Now, don't be impressed by my 5 degrees. My wife wears the PhD in our family. I'm more about quantity of degrees, and she's more about quality. I'm not going to ask where this audience falls on that question. It's pretty clear. I spent 13 years at the U.S. Department of State talking about global food policy, and wherever I went, the first question they always got was, I thought we invited USDA. And so I'd have to explain to people at the State Department we cared about food too, and they'd say, well, what's the difference between what they do at USDA and what you do at the State Department? I'd say, well, that's easy. At USDA, they do things. At the State Department, we talk about doing things. And so I'm very happy to be here today to talk about things that other people are doing, including yourselves. My day job is at the Nature Conservancy, the world's largest conservation organization, so I guess that makes me the woke tree hugger for this morning. I'm very pleased to be here and to play that role. However, I will only be playing it for 2 more days. On Saturday, I moved to the UK to launch a new food systems institute at the University of Nottingham. I asked for the title of sheriff. They gave me the title of director. It's unfortunate. I thought it would have been very cool to be the sheriff of Nottingham. But I am not going to be talking to you about any of those things today. I want to talk to you about how to talk about the things that we've discussed today. And so I think it's useful in the conversation about how we talk to other people. It's also important to that conversation about the stories we tell ourselves. So I want to begin by just thinking about the fact that in many ways, there's nothing we do that has a bigger, more negative impact on the planet than agriculture, but there's nothing more critical for our daily survival. So the challenge that we all have is how to maintain and grow the benefits and reduce the negatives. So I'm going to go through a little bit of this as we go along. If we were to talk about land, 10 to 15% of all the land are, 40% of all the land on Earth is currently being used by agriculture. The amount of cropland is the size of South America. The amount of pasture land the size of Africa. In terms of land, there's nothing bigger than agriculture. If we were to talk about water, I think you all know 70% of all fresh water goes to agriculture. The Colorado River, the largest river, or 5th largest river in America, no longer flows to the sea. So these are not the challenges of 2050. These are the realities of today. If we were to talk about climate change, 10 to 15% of greenhouse gases come from agriculture. Another 10 to 15% come from deforestation. That's 25 to 30% of emissions, almost as much as energy and more than anything else. But energy and agriculture are different. For every dollar you invest in wind and solar, you get less than $1 back because they're less efficient than fossil fuels. Now, it's critically important for a long-term future that we make these investments, but for every dollar you invest in agriculture, everywhere in the world, you get $1.43 return, positive rates of return. So you have to wonder, would consumers rather pay more for their energy or less for their food to get a cleaner environment? Now, from what I know of most Americans, they'd rather eat their way to a cleaner environment. I can say this, I don't work for the government anymore. So how do we get people excited by this opportunity that agriculture presents instead of beating up on the agriculture industry? How do we change how we communicate and how we frame these questions? Now, you also know we're going from 8 billion people today to 9.5 or 10 billion people by 2050. That's an enormous challenge as well. And we need between 50, 60% more food by 2050, maybe 100% more protein by 2050. So the challenges that we've already faced are getting even more dire. But we also have 800 million people who will go to bed hungry today. And that's not really acceptable in this world. How do we deal with that? Now, it's hard for people to wrap their minds around 800 million people. Almost 9 million people die every year of hunger-related illnesses. That's also hard for most people to really appreciate. That's 25,000 people will die today of hunger. That's 1,000 people over the next hour. That's one person every 4 seconds. Mostly women and children. Now, there's not a person in this room who wouldn't go to help that hungry child if they saw them. But too many people don't see those people in need and don't appreciate the role that you're playing. How do we help people to better understand this challenge? But because of these 800 million people going to bed hungry, we also hear a lot of people talking about a broken food system. Have you guys heard that the food system is broken? Yeah. Well, I hear that, and it makes me wonder, if the food system is broken, when was it not broken? Was it better 10 years ago than it is today? Was it better 20 or 30 years ago than it is today? I mean, for something to be broken, it has to have not been broken in the past. So I don't think that's necessarily a good way of framing the challenge we have. Obviously, 800 million people going to bed hungry is unacceptable, but does that really make the system broken? Because if we look back at the number of undernourished people on the planet, so about 10% of people are going to bed hungry, totally unacceptable. You go back 30 years ago, and it would have been about 20% of the population. You go back 50 or 60 years ago, and 30% of all the people on the planet were going to bed hungry. Things are not bad and getting worse. They are good and getting better, but not fast enough. How we frame these conversations is critically important. Childhood mortality, lowest point in all of human history. Dramatically better than any point in the past. That is not broken. How do we do better? Now, giving the example from corn production in the United States between 1980 and 2011. We are able to produce a bushel of corn today using 35% fewer greenhouse gas emissions. There's 40% less land needed to produce that crop, 40% less energy, 50% less water, and 60% less erosion on the land. I'm sure that you could give the same statistics for the swine industry. We can do this for soybeans and cotton and canola and everything else. Things are not just better, they're wildly better. But of course, we don't see the wildly better because there are a lot more people that need to be fed. And so we're not producing the same amount of food that we did in the past, we're producing more. This is from the World Resource Institute. It's sort of their menu of change. What would it take to get to a sustainable future? And they spend a lot of time, and conservation organizations spend a lot of time talking about shifting diets and reducing food waste and doing a lot of these things. What they don't spend a lot of time on is the green bar. And that green bar represents 61% of the improvement in our food system to get to a sustainable future. 61%. And what is that? It's business as usual. In other words, the improvements you're making every single day get us 2/3 to the future we want. So instead of telling the ag industry what they're not doing, perhaps we should be asking the ag industry, what can we do to help? Instead of getting to your 2050 goal by 2050, what if we could help you to get to your 2070 goal by 2050? We need to change how we think about and how we communicate and how we talk about these issues. How do we bring people together to solve problems? Things are not bad and getting worse. They are good and getting better, but not fast enough. That framing helps people to find common solutions. Now, often talk to consumers about things like sustainability, and how consumers think about sustainability is often different than how you might think about sustainability. For most consumers, they think about what I call local sustainability. If you can reduce the amount of resources put into the land, then that's a good thing. If you use less water, less fertilizer, less insecticide, that seems like it's great, right? I mean, it has a less of an impact on that land. But of course, if you don't have inputs, you don't have outputs, and so you reduce productivity. And so somebody else has to pick up the slack somewhere else. So local sustainability, the benefits are local, less eutrophication, less impact, but the impacts are global because somebody somewhere else has to pick up the slack. On the other hand, I talk about global sustainability. That's really about intensification. If we can produce more on less land, but the impacts are local, more eutrophication, more soil erosion, more impacts, but the benefits are global and hard to see. And so instead of thinking in terms of local sustainability versus global sustainability, we should think of it as a continuum from local to global, and there will always be trade-offs between the two. But some land can afford to be more intensively farmed, and some should be less intensively farmed. The diversity of the food system is the strength of the food system. How do we capture that complexity in a way that people get? Local versus global, not good versus bad, not right versus wrong. It's about choices and consequences. And it's about trade-offs. There will always be trade-offs between the two. Now, in Europe, they have what they call their farm to fork strategy, and one of the things that it calls for is a reduction in pesticide risk of 50%, fertilizer reduction of 20%, and they want to expand organic production to 25% of all the land in Europe. So that's their goal by 2030. Now, according to the European Commission's assessment of their plan, they will produce 15% less food if they implement this plan. That's a lot. What country sends the most food to Europe? Any guess? Brazil. So Europe is exporting its environmental footprint to arguably the most biodiverse country on the planet. Might not be a good idea, but it's about choices and consequences. How do we get people to understand those so that we can have a more sophisticated conversation about what the choices we really want to make sure that we get the impacts that we're willing to live with? Now, one of the things that was mentioned earlier is just how much productivity has increased. And you can really see it in this chart that the gray is the amount of land used to produce the food, and the green is how much food production has increased. And of course, that increase in food production has outpaced the growth in human population, and because of that, hunger has declined. But imagine that we were producing food today with 1960s technology. Well, there are only about 3 billion hectares of forest on the planet. And if we were using 1960s technology, we would need a third of that, 1 billion hectares, to produce the food we do. So we often think about agriculture leading to deforestation because when they cut down the forest, they replace it with soybeans and livestock production. But a quarter of that forest exists purely because of improvements in efficiency and productivity. So at the same time, agriculture is the single biggest driver of deforestation and the single biggest savior of forest. Those two things can be true of this at the same time. Again, how do we get people to sort of wrap their minds around this, that going to less intensive agriculture in terms of not having soybeans in Brazil isn't going to magically produce the food somewhere else? How do we figure out where that should be produced in a way that has the benefits for all? I like to say sustainability is a journey, it's not a destination. There's no such thing as sustainable agriculture. There's just more sustainable agriculture. Farmers today are wildly more sustainable than they were in 1960, and they will be wildly more sustainable in 2050 than they are today. What I want to see is how do we get to our 2070 goal by 2050? That's about optimism and hope. Farmers today have been on this journey for 100 years. It's great that the conservation organizations are finally catching up. But a lot of this has to do with the language we use. I've heard a lot in the last talk about efficiency and productivity. And that efficiency and productivity makes it more sustainable, but for farmers, that's just good business. For conservation, that's sustainability. We're using different language to talk about the same things, and because we do, we often talk past each other. There's this feeling, I don't want to pay for sustainability. It's like, well, do you want to make your farm more efficient? Yeah. Okay, well, I think we just agreed. And so how we talk about it can really bring people together. And that's one of the reasons that I came to work at the Nature Conservancy. How many people are familiar with the Nature Conservancy? That is a remarkably low number for the world's largest conservation organization. It's not my fault, however. I'm not head of communications for this organization. How many have heard of Intrexon, the company where I was head of communication? Oh, crap. All right. Wait, I'm gonna double check you guys. Any of you heard of Exemplar Genetics? Anybody in the room? Okay. How about Transova Genetics? Any of you? Well, that's one of our companies. There we go. Aqua Bounty, genetically engineered salmon. Yeah, that's us too. Oxitec, mosquitoes. Yep, that's us too. Viagen, animal cloning. Yep, that's us too. All things controversial. So how we talk about things matters, how it changes how we think about it. So for me, it's innovation equals efficiency, but that equals sustainability. And so how do we get it on the same page in terms of the terminology so that we can have a more sophisticated conversation? Because words matter. For conservationists, we need to move away from should and start talking about could. Anybody who has kids knows that telling people what they should do is pretty much guaranteed to get them to do the opposite. On the other hand, could is about opportunity. You know, could you be more efficient? Yeah, that sounds great. What could we do? Let's talk about it. And so just a subtle shift in language can have a wildly different outcome. And some of this comes down to the different worldviews we have. On one hand, we have this slow food movement that says we should be producing food the way we did 100 years ago. And on the other hand, we have this intensive concept of agriculture that says, no, faster, faster, faster. And today they seem to be moving in opposite directions. But what if they were just two ends of the same continuum and they both benefit the food system in different ways? Well, then actually we're not moving in different directions at all. We're just advancing at different places. Well, that would be a good thing. How do we talk about it in a way that creates opportunity? Now, I love to say that people love innovation almost as much as they despise change. And there is no place people despise change more than in the food they eat. Because food is what brings us together with friends and family. And if you mess with my food, you are messing with my family, and people don't like that. But if we don't change how we produce food, everything will change. So how do we talk about change in a way that brings people together instead of turning people off? In the last presentation, there was talk about efficiency. I don't think most consumers want a more efficient pig. I think they want more sustainably produced. They want more animal welfare. And if you can reduce the number of animals that die because of disease, well, that's a huge improvement in animal welfare. How do you talk about it in a way that it, excites people that you're doing more to help the things that they care about? I also like to say that consumers have never cared more nor known less how their food is produced. And that's also a challenge for all of us. Because, when you ask people how much do you think you know about food production, people in cities tend to say they know more than people who live in rural communities. That might not be true. People in rural communities know that they don't know anything, and people in cities think they know stuff. And so the problem, though, is that if you think you know something about food production, the things that you ask for may not deliver the benefits that you want. And so again, consumer demand, how do we harness it to deliver improvements instead of it actually driving things in the opposite direction? In Europe, driving greater adoption of organic, requiring it to be 25%. What is that going to do? It's going to erode the margin of organic production, and all of those people who sort of believe in their heart that they want to produce organically can no longer make money doing it. Because the market's not going to pay for those margins if 25% are producing things organically. So understanding how to ensure that people, their livelihoods are also taken care of. Because consumers are important, because science tells us what we can do, but it's the public that tells us what we should do. And so if we don't bring the public along, we will be lost. Again, in the last presentation, it talked about how consumers like gene editing in medicine. The problem is that in medicine, we take things when we're sick in order to get better because we're loss averse. We don't want to, we're risk-taking when we're ill. You know, you're going to take a medication to get better. But when we eat food, we're loss-averse. We don't want to take any chance in the food we eat. You know, we think that there's zero chance, and if this is 0.0001, it's like, well, that's infinitely more than zero, because zero is a really small number. And so understanding consumer psychology is really important, and so I want to spend some time talking about that a little later. As was mentioned, I wrote this book, Why Smart People Make Bad Food Choices, a couple years ago. Anybody read it? Ah, shoot. Okay. That explains a lot. Okay, so, but I was wondering, I had this question in my mind, why is it that 42% of all Americans are obese, and yet we have nutrition labels, fact panels on the back of our food, we have menu labeling at the restaurants, we know a lot about health and nutrition, much more than our grandparents, and our grandparents were cooking with lard, and nobody was obese. So it's like all the things you would want to make people healthier have not delivered that. And so that was the thing that was like, so that drove me to write this book. And so if we go back to 1975, you'll see that basically no country on the planet has an obesity rate above 15%, and the obesity rate in the United States was lower than most parts of Europe. So we often think of America as, you know, having a high obesity rate, but it was lower than most parts of Europe. Nothing was different. It's just moved more quickly in the United States. You fast forward to today, and of course, basically no country on the planet has an obesity rate below 15%. So we say people's consumer food habits are hard to change, and yet they have changed dramatically. And so this is the one area where things have definitely gone in the wrong direction. But we tend to spend a lot of our time talking about willpower and nutrients and all these things, but what's really changed is our entire food environment. How we consume food, the portions that we have, snacking, all these things, and yet we tend to focus on the fat content or other things. Our grandparents knew nothing about health and nutrition, but they lived in a very different food environment. So again, how do we talk about things? How do we engage in conversations around food? 50% of all Americans have a diet-related chronic disease, and this is causing the cost to our healthcare system is $1 trillion every year. $1 trillion. Think if we shifted that budget to making sure that people had healthy food, to investing in our food system. We'd have a very different food system than the $5 or $10 billion that we're currently investing. It's about 5% of what we invest in the medications to help treat people that get the diseases that are caused by not investing in food and agriculture. How do we shift that mindset? Because organizations that advance sustainability and health goals, they're going to thrive. And how do you communicate the contribution that your sector has to making people healthier? So I now want to talk a little bit about that consumer psychology. How do we understand the consumer better in order to be able to communicate what we do better? So I want to give you guys a little test here. You can see A and B squares up there. Which one do you think is darker? Raise your hand if you think it's A. Okay, raise your hand if you think it's B. Okay, we got some people. I'm not sure why you're saying that, but okay. All right. Now, when I first looked at this visual illusion, I was like, I'm not sure I trust what was actually there. So I literally like clipped a piece of the color from one, and then I slid it across, and you know what? It is exactly the same. And what's going on here? Why does this matter? Well, our brain looks at this, and it thinks that B is in shadow. So it's already adjusting that color. And it sees that transition of shades of gray between A and B, and it's color correcting for us. It's trying to make it look right. But what it's really doing is it's tricking us. And I tell you this because we go through our days every day thinking that we know things. We are confident of the answers, and sometimes our brains are just lying to us. So if you leave here thinking only or knowing only one thing, it is do not trust your brain. It is totally unreliable. I really hate to say that, but we cannot trust our brains. Any of you familiar with confirmation bias? This idea that we seek out information that's consistent with our beliefs and we discount information that's inconsistent with our beliefs? We are all remarkably good at identifying bias in other people. We are not so good at identifying bias in ourselves. And if we can't understand our own biases, we can't begin to really address other people. So I like to tell the story of my own bias. So if I were to read a newspaper article that said, organic agriculture is more nutritious than conventional agriculture, what am I going to do? I'm going to ask, who are the authors, who funded the research, and what was their methodology? All the scientists in the room think pretty decent approach, right? Okay, so what would happen if the article said, organic agriculture, no more nutritious than conventional agriculture? What am I going to do? I'm going to tweet it, right? Yeah. I mean, I'm sure that these guys are fine. I'm sure that they used an excellent methodology. Now, the first group, if I had read that somebody worked on an organic farm when they were a teenager, I'd think, aha, that researcher's biased. Instead of recognizing that just by asking that question, I'm the one who's biased. We need to really be careful, because the more we do that, the more we're sort of willing to suspend our own belief and ask ourselves tough questions, the better we will be at having a conversation with somebody else about their biases. Not that we actually have biases, but we go through this process, right? So how do we understand the consumer? Availability heuristic, just a complicated way of saying what things come to mind when I say a word. So when I say the word natural, are you guys thinking butterflies and puppies and rainbows? Or PRRS, Ebola, and Salmonella? All natural, right? But our minds just go to this happy place when we hear the word natural. The word natural on a label is far more convincing and shifts behavior more than the word organic, which actually means something, right? And so understanding consumer psychology and how to talk about things actually empowers us to have a conversation, and it also protects us from, again, it's like, ooh, that's all natural. I'm going to buy that. So how do we understand? Any of you heard the idea that if you can't pronounce the ingredients in something, you shouldn't eat it? Yeah, I've definitely heard that one. And, it just makes me want to, yell at people, because it's like, that's so stupid, right? I mean, there are lots of words I can't pronounce. It doesn't mean I shouldn't eat them. And so, you want to beat them up with science. I'm sure everybody in this room wants to beat people up with science whenever they do that. But it doesn't work very well. Now, on the other hand, you can, show them the constituents of food. And now my wife and you guys can pronounce all this, but most people can't. Right? And so they look at this and they kind of laugh, and they realize, oh yeah, I guess stuff is made of complicated words and I actually can't pronounce any of them. And they laugh. It's the difference between leading somebody to knowledge and beating them up with science. You can guess which one works better. People go on the internet and they watch YouTube videos, they watch TED Talks, for hours about things that they don't even care about, but they're really entertaining. If somebody does something really well, Eric mentioned Angela Duckworth earlier, just a good presentation can keep you locked to that screen to learn something. We need to do a better job of communicating. We also need to understand what trends mean and not just listen to what people tell us they mean. So I want to give you an example. I think most of us would say that consumers care more about transparency in their food than they did maybe 10 or 15 years ago. Is that a reasonable assumption? All right, so how many people think consumers will care even more about transparency in their food 15, 20 years from now? How many people think they'll care more? Okay, how many people think it'll be about the same? Okay, how many people think they will not care at all about transparency? That's what I think, and I agree with you. All right, so why? How could that be? Well, for me, transparency today is where food safety was 100 years ago. People cared about food safety because their food would kill them. And then brands came along, not as a quality indicator, but just as proof that our food won't kill you. And then as food became safer, it became a quality standard instead of just a I'm not going to kill you standard. And so the problem is that food safety started as something that companies aspired to, But as food became safer, it became a floor that was expected. So 20 years from now, consumers won't care about transparency, but they will expect all food to be safe or transparent. So as a business or as an organization or a sector, the question isn't, should I be more transparent? The question is, do you want to do it today when the market might reward you, or do you want to do it 10 years from now after you have been punished by the market for a transparency failure? And so that's a different way of thinking about the future is, yeah, transparency will continue to be important to what you do, but it won't be the same for the consumer. So understanding that things don't always proceed in the way that we imagine them to. Some of you may have seen this report from this organization, Rethink X, that says basically livestock production will be gone by 2030. That's not going to happen. But you know, there are a lot of people talking about what the impact of alternative proteins and other things are going to be on the livestock industry or the pork industry or others. There was just this announcement about cultivated meat. And so, you know, it makes people nervous about their futures. Bill Gates came out with a new book a couple years ago, and one of the things he said was, by 2030, we'll all be eating synthetic meat. How many of you are going to be eating synthetic meat in 2030? I can't see the hands. Maybe they should be higher. I'm sorry. No? Okay. All right. Well, maybe Bill Gates is wrong. But what I do know is that when he talks about it in that language, he makes that future less likely. His use of that term, because nobody wants to eat synthetic meat. You know, they want quality meat at affordable prices, but how we talk about things matters. Because when we talk about synthetic meat, that makes people mad. Any of you familiar, and if people get mad, they react about it. Any of you familiar, so we want to think differently about these problems. Have some of you heard that studies that say that young people today are the most open to these alternative proteins and plant-based? You know, you've seen some of those studies? Well, you know, they're also eat meat at the highest rates. Like, things can be true at the same time. They're more open to alternatives, and yeah, they're still eating a lot of meat. And yet we read one headline, and it makes us nervous, you know, about maybe our future or about your future. And how we interpret and understand these things is important, because it can de-escalate some of that tension that Eric talked about in the beginning, so that we can really reflect on the information and decide how to respond. So, have anybody heard of clean meat? Not too many. Have you heard of cultivated meat? Yeah, some of you, you know, lab grown. So, well, 5 years ago, it was called clean meat. And I went to give a talk at one of the conferences, New Harvest, that was one of the organizations that was doing the research for this sector. And at that time, it was called clean meat. And so at this talk, I told them they needed to kill the term. And they were not happy with it. You know, as soon as I got off stage, people were like, we have done tons of consumer research, and everybody says this is the best, and they like it. And look, if you call it clean meat, people who produce animal meat, you're saying that their product is dirty and unethical, but you're also telling the consumer that they eat stuff that's unethical. And telling people that you're evil is not a great way of getting consumers. Like, when they read this in a questionnaire, they don't really understand the moral implications of what that question is saying. But when they do, it actually makes them annoyed. And so while I was at this conference, there were like these online debates, you know, where the livestock industry was like really angry with them for using terms like clean meat and suggesting that their products were going to be safer and better for the planet. Today, you know, not many people really talked about the cultivated meat, because changing that terminology really de-escalated that tension, because cultivated meat might sound stupid to you, but you're not going to tweet about it. You know, it's like, we're lazy. We're not going to get involved. And so I spent 10 months working with the companies in that sector to get them all to stop using the term, because the words we use matters. And, you know, you may worry about what happens if these things are successful, but we're going from 8 to 9.5 or 10 billion people. We have to double protein by 2050. Do you think we should double protein by doubling the number of livestock on the planet by 2050? How many people think that's the right solution? It's okay if you do. For me, if we got to 2050 and 100% of that growth came from alternative proteins, that's a $1.5 trillion opportunity. They're never going to get there. But if they did, you would still produce exactly the same amount of animals, but you would triple your income because demand would be much higher. Right? So, we're fighting. You should want them to be successful. I was talking to the U.S. Roundtable on Sustainable Beef last month, and I said, you guys should be fighting deforestation in Brazil even more than the Nature Conservancy. Because if we can end deforestation, we can end the expansion of livestock production down in Brazil, and your incomes will go up. So how we think about these things, it sort of changes how you look at a problem. It's like, that's not my problem to, maybe it is my problem. How do we bring people together to solve problems? So some of the thoughts I want to leave you with is that, we need to stop planning for the future that we expect. A lot of us engage in strategic planning. Many of your organizations will. What you do with strategic planning is you look ahead into the future and you think, what do I think is most likely to happen? And then let me prepare for it. That's strategic planning. And that's fine. Businesses have to do that. But from a futurist perspective, what I want to do is I want to look ahead and say, yeah, this is most likely, but this future scenario would be great for my industry. So instead, I want to make decisions to get me to my preferred future, not to the most likely future, because there's a future out there in which we all succeed, in which we all have a better planet. And that's the one we need to get to. So we need to create the future we want and stop planning for the future we expect. And what does this look like in practice? So I want to give you an example. I was working with the Rockefeller Foundation's Food System Vision Prize a couple years ago, and so I was asked to mentor 2 of the 10 finalists, the Dutch team and the Chinese team, and both of those teams had as their 2030 goal reducing animal agriculture by 30%. And I told them, I said, look, if that's your goal, do not expect the livestock industry to be on board with it. I don't think anybody wants to go out of business, right? But what if instead your goal was to reduce the environmental impact of protein production by 30%? I think you guys could do a good job of helping us get there. So you can define the same goal in a way that seems like an opportunity. Well, let's get some resources in here. Let's figure out how we can do that. Because 2/3 of the improvement we're going to have is going to come from you. It's not going to come from alternative proteins. That's going to fill the gap. It's going to close the gap. So we need to make the current food system better, and we need to think about what a future food system might look like. And we need to keep in mind some of the demographic trends Joe mentioned earlier. We often think about China and India as the markets, but as Joe pointed out, in 2030, 8 of the 10 largest economies in the world will be in Africa. That's where all of the protein demand is going to be. So you know what? If Americans were to eat less meat because we should eat less food, there is a global market for it. There is huge demand. Many parts of the world having access to more animal protein is the fastest path to improve cognitive development, to reduce stunting. It is about opportunity. We would be healthier, and they would be healthier, and we would all be more sustainable. See, right now, Europe is driving livestock producers out of business, but they still have the same demand. And so all of the protein that's going to come into Europe will come with a higher environmental cost than what they're driving out of business. That might not be a good idea. And so how do we get people excited about the low emissions and productivity of American products and see that actually, even if Americans were to reduce consumption, we should continue to produce just as much or more. That will be better for the planet if we can offset those production in other parts of the world. So how do we think differently about the problems in front of us? So a couple of closing thoughts. We're going from 8 billion people today to 9.5 billion people by 2050. That's a challenge. But after 2050, population growth slows dramatically. And that's because we're not having more kids. We maybe reached peak child already. The number of kids born this year is basically the same as next year and a little bit less after that. So imagine for a moment that productivity increases fast enough to get to 2050 without screwing things up. And if it continued on into the future, for the first time in human history, we won't need dramatically more food. There's this huge opportunity after 2050, but it requires us to get there without cutting down all of our forests and draining our rivers, our lakes, and our aquifers. Because every day between now and 2050, it gets harder to feed the world. Every day after 2050, it will get easier to feed the world. The challenge is not to do better and better forever. It's just to get to 2050 without screwing things up. So the thought I want to leave you with is the next 30 years are not just the most important 30 years there have ever been in the history of agriculture. And they are. They're the most important 30 years there will ever be. If we get to 2050 and things are fine, we are good forever. And that's why these conversations are so important and the work you're doing is so critical and why it matters that consumers understand. Because science tells us what we can do, but it's the public that tells us what we should do. And if we don't bring them along, the worst scenario is not that we get to 2050 and we've screwed things up, which would be bad. It's that we get to 2050 and we've got the solutions to saving the world and we don't get to use them. I'm a science optimist but a regulatory pessimist. I'm confident that you can help us to get there, but I'm not at all convinced that we'll be allowed to go there. And that's why we need to close this gap. So some just closing points. Things are better, getting better, not worse, but just not fast enough. Sustainability is a journey, not a destination. There are no perfect solutions, only trade-offs. How we communicate really does matter, and the next 30 years are going to determine the fate of the planet. Thank you very much.
Okay, maybe a minute or two for some questions. Got one right here.
Yes.
How does our sustainability trajectory over the last 50 years compare to other protein producers in the world? And does it matter to our future customer, i.e. Africa?
So many parts of the world are on similar trajectories, just not at the same time. So Brazil is coming along behind, and Europe is ahead in some areas, but maybe moving behind. But it won't matter today to people in Africa because there's large hunger there, but to the other markets it does. And so we need to think about sort of shifting things around. So if Europe were to meet its own needs, it wouldn't need that food from Brazil, and then that food from Brazil would be able to go to these markets. If Americans and Europeans were to eat less and we could reduce obesity, then that food would be freed up in order for more people to be able. So that'll modulate some of the price increase because we're eating a different plate of food. But I think demand is still likely to be high. But that's where in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa they'd be fine eating more beans and lentils and other things that are really part of their diets. It doesn't have to be beef and pork or poultry or salmon or something. So if we can create opportunities that work within people's culture and diet, we can actually do some of this better than just exporting the American diet and then trying to fix it every place else. It would be better to get to the good place faster, just like people did with cell phones, right? They skipped right over landlines and went straight to cell phones in villages in Africa. Yeah.
Our food is historic.
Yeah.
How would this whole conversation change?
Well, if it gets more expensive, then market forces will push it back. So, it's not likely to get wildly more expensive for a long period of time. But, it definitely changes, during, with the price issues in Ukraine. That changed how Europeans are thinking about the Farm to Fork strategy and the implementation guidelines for some of their Conservation Act and other things. So it did stop people. But, food prices are going to be cyclical. I think we do need to make things better, but we often talk about the efficiency instead of the animal welfare or the sustainability of what you're doing. And so I think you're already on a path that delivers a lot of what the consumer wants. We're just not talking about it in a way that resonates with the consumer at all. And we need to do that, because you need to be free to bring these alternative proteins to market just as much as we need to bring gene-edited products to market. You know, I don't think it matters that 80% of people say they're neutral about gene editing and 30% or 20% are supportive. We have no idea until a product comes to market how people are going to respond, and we don't know what conservation organizations are going to do. And so that's why building alliances and partnerships and relationships and getting to know people before there's a problem is far better than trying to deal with it, you know, after something arises, because the divisions are already there. But the Nature Conservancy is working, you know, in every state, 76 countries around the world. We have 200,000 acres under our own management. You know, we're working with farmers and ranchers and indigenous communities every day. It's not an activist organization. It believes that if it doesn't work for the farmer, it doesn't work. And so there are partners out there that I think can help to share that story.
Time for one more.
Or you can catch
All
me
right here in the
at
front.
lunch. Yeah.
So why do smart people make bad eaters?
It's our food environment. I mean, you know, if anybody who's eaten at Cheesecake Factory knows, you get 2 portions for the size of one, but the plates are so big that you don't even notice it. You know, I've gone there and thought, hey, I can eat all that, but unlike most people, I pulled out a 9-inch plate from my wife's purse and I replated my food, and then I pulled out a tape measure. It's a 15-inch plate by 12 inches. So 2 adult portions of food looks like it's not even a lot of food, right? But, you know, we reward people, companies, for giving us a lot. You know, eating 2 meals for the price of one is a terrible value. Getting 2 meals for the price of one is fantastic. So how do we change that culture so that they offer you the, would you like half of that to go, before you've ever taken a bite? You'd be like, absolutely. And then if you want to open it up, you will. But we know human behavior. Nobody's going to break open that box and do it, you know, because you're going to wait 10 minutes, you're going to realize, actually, that was perfectly fine. So attack it through behavior or our environment. Don't blame people, you know.
Great.
All right.
Couple quick housekeeping items. The lunch that will be served, speaking of food and portion sizes. As you leave, you'll go up the stairs. It's on the 2nd floor. And the breakout sessions for this afternoon, 1 will be in here, and the other 3 will be also on the 2nd floor. So let's give Jack and all the speakers from this morning another round.